You're listening to The Inspired Guide, episode 41. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Darlene Victoria. I am happy to be back with you today. We are talking about all things podcasting this week in the Let's Talk About Podcasting series. Today, I'm tackling the question, what would you say to someone who wants to start a podcast but doesn't really have an audience? Or what would you say to someone who wants to start a podcast but knows it's not going to be perfect and they're stuck in the overthinking or brainstorming around the podcast, but not taking the leap to put it out into the world? Let's jump in with the first one. What would you say to someone who wants to start a podcast but doesn't really have an audience? If you have a passion for a specific topic and want to share your view on that specific topic, then go for it. There are ways to grow your audience. So if you're starting out with an audience of one or none, there are marketing ideas and tips that you can utilize to grow your audience. But also, I'd like to put things into perspective for you. When you think of an audience and numbers, an audience can be an audience of 1, 2, hundreds, thousands, or more. When you're starting out, even if your podcast episodes get 10 to 20 downloads, that's 10 to 20 potential people you're reaching about your topic. And that's 10 to 20 more people than you may be reaching right now without a podcast. Also, to put things into perspective a little bit more, according to Rob Walsh, VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn, a podcast episode that has been live approximately 30 days on average gets 141 downloads. That's on average. So if you have a podcast with over 34,000 downloads in the first 30 days, you're in the top 10%. And if you have over 9,000 downloads for your podcast episode, which is live approximately 30 days, you're in the top 5%. And lastly, if you have over 50,000 downloads per episode, again, after having it live for 30 days, you are in the top 1%. So putting that into perspective, having an audience of 10 to 20 people is pretty darn amazing. If you're thinking about launching a podcast or you have one already and you're trying to determine which strategies to employ for audience growth, because there are many, I do have a download on my website over at darlenevictoria.com that has over 20 marketing ideas and tips for promoting your podcast. In addition, I also have a promoting your podcast launch, which has a little bit different of a checklist and different tasks that you can do to promote your new podcast. And this is a download I actually provide to my one-on-one launch clients only. However, if you're listening to this episode and you want a copy of that promoting your podcast launch checklist, just send me an email to podcast@darlenevictoria.com to request a copy, and I'll gladly send it back to you for free. The second part of this person's question was, what would you say to someone who wants to start a podcast but knows it's not going to be perfect and they're stuck in the overthinking or brainstorming around the podcast but not taking the leap to put it out into the world? First and foremost, remember how I said if you're reaching 10 to 20 people, that's pretty awesome, because prior to starting a podcast, you might not have been reaching 10 to 20 people at all. If you have something to say and you want someone to hear it, what are you waiting for? But my bestie and I produced a podcast together over a year ago, and we had a guest on to discuss all things productivity. And the big takeaway out of that interview for both of us was when he said, done is better than perfect. The same is true for starting a podcast. Know that your first podcast episode is probably going to stink, and it's definitely not going to be as good as your 100th episode. And your 100th episode isn't going to be great as your 200th episode. But you got to start somewhere. So my advice is start. Jump in. Keep honing your craft. Keep learning and keep taking risks with your podcast. As you continue on, you will improve. Your processes will improve. The overthinking and the brainstorming issues will fall away. Podcasting, especially when it comes to indie podcasting, it doesn't have any real rules. The rules truly are what you make them. I believe you should have a plan and you should have some organization skills under your belt. But know that even the best laid plans, well, they tend to be broken. And so I want to leave you with this thought. A few years ago, I ended up getting sick and I knew I was going to miss a production task for an episode for one of my clients. And I felt really terrible. But her response was this, and I'll paraphrase it. She offered her get well wishes. And then she said, "After all, Darlene, we're just creating a podcast. We're not saving babies." So yes, it's true. You are putting yourself out into the world, but you're human. You're not meant to be perfect. But at the end of the day, show up authentically, show up passionately, and show up honestly. And the rest will work itself out. Start today. You won't be sorry. I promise you. And that's all I have for you today. If you'd like to grab the Promoting Your Podcast tip sheet, head on over to darlenevictoria.com. You'll see it all over the place on the homepage. I believe there's even a nifty little drop-down box that pops up on the website. And if you're about to launch a podcast and you want to grab a copy of my Promoting Your Podcast launch checklist, send me an email to podcast@darlenevictoria.com. That's it. Tomorrow I will be back with another podcast episode, this time talking more about production of your podcast. And one of my clients sent me this question where she asked, "Hey Darlene, is there a best time to evolve your podcast to including guest interviews? And if so, how do I ensure a quality recording for that?" I'll answer that and a little bit more on tomorrow's episode. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, be inspired by the most important person in your life, you. And yes, start that podcast. Until tomorrow, this is Darlene Victoria signing out. Oh, before you go, I would love to connect with you. You can follow me on Instagram @DVPodcasts. And you can also find me on Facebook. Just look for Darlene Victoria Digital Media.